Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, guys, and welcome to episode 36 of the podcast. I cannot believe that. It blows my mind sometimes when I think of how many episodes we've done, how many books we've read. That is so cool. And I hope you all are ready to dive into this one today, and hope you all are enjoying your summer because, I don't know, like this time of year is so nice to just read a book by the pool and just chill out with a drink in hand. It's just like, one of my favorite activities. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Scarlet Slipper Mystery, and this is book number 32, and it was published in 1954. So I was able to find two separate covers in my Google searches, and if you ever want to see these covers before the episode, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So for the 1950s version of the Scarlet Slipper Mystery, we have Nancy and Henry and Helene Fontaine on the cover. And Nancy's wearing a red shirt and she's got the blonde curled hair. She kind of looks like Rosemary Clooney from White Christmas, but you can see her pointing at these red slippers on this picture of a ballerina. And in the story, Henry paints these pictures of his sister Helene, who is a ballerina. Also, it looks like they're in a log cabin, which this is kind of a nice touch because in the story, Nancy actually hides the Fontaines at one of Ned Nickerson's estates because the Nickersons have a log cabin. So that's kind of a cool detail that the artist took note of. I love when the book covers actually have to do with the book. It's kind of nice. It's like a music video that has nothing to do with the song. You know, it just doesn't make sense. But the second edition on the revised book cover is Nancy, and she's wearing a green dress. She's got the curled strawberry blonde hair. It's got mostly a blue background, and she's holding this picture of Helene wearing the red slippers. So the funny cover spoof that I came up with, and I did this one for the original because there's just more going on. I said, see, those are the shoes I wanted, but they weren't on sale or in my size. Now, as far as the cover rating goes, I rated the original cover 2 magnifying glasses. It wasn't my favorite, but the revised I actually liked better than the original, which is usually not the case, and I gave it a 3 magnifying glass rating. So we have several characters in the Scarlet Slipper Mystery. We have Henry and Helene Fontaine, who are a brother and sister duo who teach dance classes at a studio in River Heights. There is Millie Koff, who is a dancer, and her father comes into the picture in some parts of the book. Mr. Howard, who owns an antique store. Miss Boyd, who bought a figurine from that antique store. Miss Parsons, who's running a charity fundraiser where there's a dance being put on. There is Raoul Judson and his wife, Mrs. Judson, Raymond Bull, Thomas Renee, Anton Schmidt, who is Koff's cousin, Red Busby, and Duparc. So I bet you can already tell from just that list of characters there's quite a few aliases in this book, so you probably know how I'm going to feel about it. So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis. Nancy encounters a man on her flight from the country of Centrovia, but doesn't think much of it until later when Bess takes her to her dance studio, looking for her purse, and they run into her instructors, who are upset about a threatening note. They are also from Centrovia and had to flee many years ago for France, but their parents were part of the resistance. When Nancy and Bess leave the studio, Nancy sees the man from the plane and chases him, but he escapes. Later, through a coincidence, Nancy becomes aware of a woman who received a chipped figurine, and when she talks to the store owner who sold it, they find every figurine has the same flaw, so they break them open and find a coded note. Nancy convinces the Fontaines to pretend to leave town and then come to stay with her. They are followed at points, but Nancy eludes the stalker. The next day at the dance studio, Nancy gets pushed down the stairs by some woman named Miss Judson when Nancy says she doesn't know where the Fontaines are. George chases the woman and picks up some mail she drops, and on a hunch, Nancy has Hannah steam the wax seal off, and underneath is the same code from the bisque figurines. Nancy also discovers that a man named Thomas Rene commissioned pictures of a ballerina in red slippers to be made by Henry Fontaine years ago, around the same time the actual red slippers of Helene's are stolen from the studio. Nancy finds out that jewels are being smuggled in the paintings. She and Ned are double-crossed by Rene. The Fontaines escape their captors, and the bad guys are apprehended. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Art is in the eye of the beholder, Centrovian crime ring busted, and dance studio owners acquitted of any wrongdoing. So I took down several direct quotes and notes for this one, so let's jump right in. So on the first page, the engine of the plane goes out that Nancy is on, and she's completely calm about it. I was like, what? The man near her starts mumbling about his life's work and his country of Centrovia, and he's obviously panicked, right? Because the plane is, gonna crash, or it might coast to a stop. But I was like, how can Nancy be so calm? And also, as soon as I read that this man is from this made-up country of Centrovia, I could not help but think of the Princess Diaries and Genovia. Centrovia, Centrovia. I mean, they really don't try with some of these made-up countries. I'm like, I know they're trying to avoid an international incident or insulting people, but I don't know. Centrovia. It kind of reminds me of the city that I went to in Texas called Flatonia, and I could not, the whole time I was there, I wanted to talk like Borat, like Flatonia, and just anyway. So Nancy was apparently in New York and saw 3 shows. I said, dang, most people could only afford one Broadway show, but Nancy went to 3 of them. The next note that I wrote down is Nancy asks what Bess has been up to, and she says, I lost 2 pounds. And she joined a dance class focused on reducing. And George says, yes, Bess takes it off dancing and puts it all back on by eating. George. One of these days, George. One of these days. Can anyone just let Bess live her life? I don't get it, but she will get justice in the later books. I swear she will. The next thing that I took note of is Henry tells Nancy she is, quote, very pretty and hardly looks like a detective. A compliment and an insult. Pray tell, what does a detective look like exactly? A man, a large, older man with a hooked nose? Please, what does a picture of a man next to the word detective in the Webster Dictionary look like? Now, according to Henry and Helene, their country, Centrovia, was invaded and they had to flee to France. And their parents tried to help the resistance, but I guess they died? I don't know. They're kind of vague about it in the book. But their mother was a ballet dancer, so I guess that's where Helene gets it from. Now, the next note that I took down is Nancy sees the same man from the plane who was, pleading for his life because he thought the plane was going down, outside the studio that the Fontaines run, and she chases him, but he gets away. So he comes back at several points during this story. Oh, but we do get another description of Nancy's house, which I took down. Nancy's home is described in this one as a spacious home with a driveway lined with sycamores and flowers. I think I would like Nancy's house. So at this point in the book, Nancy convinces the Fontaines to pretend to leave River Heights, and then they come to stay with the Drews. So they go through this crazy routine to, keep anyone from following them. So they take a plane, then a train, and then Nancy picks them up. So it's literally like planes, trains, and automobiles. And so she has to lose a tail along the way. But later on at the dance studio, there's a crazy woman that comes, and her name is Miss Judson, and she's looking for the Fontaines. And when Nancy won't tell her where they are, she just shoves her down the stairs. So George chases after her and picks up a letter that she drops, and later Nancy finds the same code from the figurines under the stamp. So earlier in the book, this woman comes to Nancy and she says, I think I need to talk to your dad. I think I may need to sue this antique shop owner because he won't let me return this figurine. It's got a crack in it. So Nancy goes down there, and it turns out all the figurines from that shipment have the same flaw, and they break them open and find this code. So there's a similar code on this letter that Miss Judson dropped. The next note that I took down has to do with Nancy's house again, but Hannah apparently has a whole sewing room for herself up on the 2nd floor. Pretty cool. So Nancy and Ned are having dinner with the Fontaines, and the man from the plane, who turns out to be Mr. Cough, Millie Cough's father, shows up at their house, and everyone decides to trust him, but after he leaves, everyone agrees it's probably safer if the Fontaines leave. Like, nobody can decide if we're going to trust this guy or not. So Nancy just packs up all their things, and it says George and Nancy are amused at how happy Hannah is to see them leave. Like, she doesn't like them. I think it's because she says she thinks they're just bringing trouble. So not long after Henry and Helene leave and they go to stay at Ned's cabin, these masked people break into the Drew home looking for them, and they tie Hannah up and wrap Togo up in the curtains. So Nancy and Ned have driven off at this point, but when she comes back, she finds Hannah tied to a chair and Togo's locked in the closet, and she finds this painter's palette knife with the letter R on it. The next note that I took down is Ned says, "It isn't often that I get a chance to ride along the Muskoka River with you in the moonlight. Guess I can thank my lucky stars tonight." So Ned's trying to be romantic here, but I don't know, he still hasn't redeemed himself for thinking that Nancy was going to run off with a circus clown in the last book. Now, the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy is teaching at the dancing school when a woman who looks like a witch steals Helene's red slippers. So these kids that she's leading through, like Swan Lake and all these little dance routines, they point over into the office and they're like, "There's a witch!" And so this woman, runs in. It's Mrs. Judson, we find out later, and she just steals Helene's shoes because she thinks there's something valuable in them. So later we find out why, because Nancy discovers that there's jewels hidden in the ballerina paintings that Henry did. So this guy named Rene commissioned 12 paintings, and he used a certain painting technique, and there's actual jewels in the paintings. It's pretty wild. Also, in this book, Nancy, Bess, and George get carjacked by Raoul Judson. So not only does Miss Judson push Nancy down some stairs, but her husband holds them at knife point and tells them to take him to the Fontaines because they're mad because Nancy's hidden them. And so instead, she drives to a friend's house who she knows is a state trooper. I thought that was pretty smart that she did that. But he does get away, but he gets caught later. But Rene, the man who commissioned the paintings from Henry Fontaine, double-crosses Nancy and ties her up and stuffs her in Ned's car in the woods. So we've been carjacked, we've been tied up, there's a lot of bad things that happen to Nancy in this book. On a lighter note, though, Ned's car is a cream convertible now. I think a few books back it was a green sports car, unless he traded in it or something. I thought that was just something cool to take note of. And then Renee and Duparc set the farmhouse on fire with Nancy, Bess, George, and the Fontaines in it. This was interesting because I don't think we've really seen a fire like this up to this point where they're trapped in, the building that's actually on fire. But there's a couple paragraphs with some foreshadowing where Bess is she notices the smell of kerosene, and then by the time they figure it out, it's too late. But they're able to climb out using some bed sheets that they tie together, and they narrowly miss being burned alive. And the last note that I took down is newspapers all over the country report on Nancy solving this case. So up to this point, I think she's just gotten local news coverage by the River Heights newspapers and the media. So I was like, oh, okay, Nancy's going international now. So the next segment of this podcast, I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. There were a few times where Hannah made sandwiches and milk for everybody, but for the most part, she didn't do too much cooking. But Nancy does give Hannah some tea and Togo a biscuit after they're attacked by those people wearing masks. Hannah has been attacked and tied up way too many times for my liking so far in the series, and we're only in the 30s of the books, so I'm like, oh no, I hope this doesn't happen to Hannah anymore. She deserves a vacation, not just some tea. Now for the add that to your resume section of the podcast, I said that Nancy could put down that she's fluent in French because it mentions that, which is weird. Sometimes in these books, Nancy will have a skill in one book and then she magically doesn't have it in another. But she's fluent in French in this one, and she's also a dancer. I'm still waiting for the tap dancing in Morse code from the clue of the tapping heels to come back at some point, but so far, no dice. Now on to the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about the Scarlet Slipper Mystery. So I thought it was pretty cool that they put the jewels in the paintings. They used a certain sort of painting technique, and I know nothing about painting, so it meant nothing to me. But that was kind of cool. But the things I didn't like, of course, one of my main gripes with some of these books, I don't like so many aliases. It just confuses me. And Centrovia, I was like, wow, that is the most made up sounding country, which, I mean, there's a lot of books that do that, but it was just funny. So I gave the Scarlet Slipper Mystery a 2 magnifying glass rating. It's not one of my favorite books. It's not the worst, but I don't know, I feel like the last few books have been really highly rated, and that's to be expected with reading so many of these books. There's definitely ones that stick out to me as really, really good, and then some that I'm like, So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the witch tree symbol. So if you like the Amish and people being accused of being witches, then you will probably like next week's episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.